The invitation had come as a shock. Sarah held the crisp white card in her hands, reading her son's name printed elegantly in silver letters, with the words "cordially invited" shimmering underneath. She felt a strange mix of emotions flood her as she stood in her tiny kitchen, staring down at the invitation to Ethan's wedding. After years of silence, unanswered phone calls, and holidays spent alone, this was the first contact she'd had with him since he'd walked out of her life. The invitation felt more like a riddle than an actual attempt at reconciliation. Was this his way of reaching out to her? Was it a genuine olive branch? Or was it simply a polite obligation, a gesture born of societal pressure? For years, Sarah had wondered what went wrong. She raised Ethan alone, his father having left when he was a child. She worked 3 jobs, stretched every dollar, and sacrificed so much so Ethan could go to the best schools, wear decent clothes, and have a shot at a future. She remembered tucking him in after long shifts at the diner, reading him stories about heroes who overcame adversity, about families who stuck together through thick and thin. They were all she had. She'd woven those tales into his childhood, hoping he'd understand the value of resilience, loyalty, and love. But as Ethan grew older, something changed. He began to pull away, influenced by friends, and a world that seemed glamorous and unachievable to Sarah. He grew embarrassed of their small house, her worn-out clothes, and the way she seemed to always be tired. She saw it in his eyes, a silent judgment, an unspoken shame he carried as he compared their life to the lives of others. Then one day, Ethan simply stopped answering her calls. At first, she thought it was a phase, a young man needing space to discover himself. But as days turned into months, and then into years, Sarah realized he'd shut her out completely. She tried to reach out on birthdays and holidays, sending cards and leaving voicemails, each one a little more desperate than the last. But there was only silence in return. Her heart broke a little more each time, but she never gave up hope. She clung to the idea that one day he'd realize that family meant more than material success, that he'd remember the love she poured into every single day of his childhood. So when the invitation arrived, it stirred something deep inside her. It was like a small, fragile spark of hope in a place she'd long thought darkened. She couldn't help but wonder if he had finally come around, if he was ready to open the door he'd shut so firmly. She knew she had to go, not out of pride or duty, but because, in her heart, she still held onto a mother's love that couldn't simply be snuffed out by years of abandonment. The day of the wedding arrived, and Sarah prepared with a mix of excitement and apprehension. She wore a modest dress, one she'd saved for special occasions, though she hadn't found many in recent years. As she caught her reflection in the mirror, she took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had a right to be there. She was his mother, after all. When she arrived at the wedding venue, an opulent hall with cascading flowers and a grand entrance, she felt her heart quicken. The sight was almost too much for her. The wealth, the elegance, and the sheer extravagance seemed worlds away from the life they'd shared. As she made her way inside, she could feel the eyes of strangers upon her, lingering just a bit too long, as if she were an unexpected guest. She heard hushed whispers, felt the curious stares, and saw the subtle glances exchanged by the guests. Sarah walked further in, gripping her small purse tightly, forcing herself to ignore the uncomfortable sensation building in her chest. Her breath caught when she saw him. Ethan, standing near the altar, looking dapper in a finely tailored suit, his face radiant with joy as he spoke with his friends and soon-to-be bride. He looked every bit the part of the successful young man she'd always dreamed he'd become. But in that moment, he felt like a stranger. She stood there, frozen, as she watched him laugh and talk, his face illuminated with happiness. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him smile like that. It was as if she were looking at a version of him she'd never met, a version of him she hadn't been invited to know. Her heart raced as she slowly made her way over, feeling every bit the intruder she suspected she was. She hadn't even reached him when one of his friends spotted her and called out, alerting him to her presence. Ethan turned, his face falling as his eyes met hers. The joy that had been there moments before was replaced by a look she could only describe as discomfort, maybe even regret. He looked at her, his mother, with the same distant, impassive gaze he might reserve for a stranger. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure as she greeted him. "Mom," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. He glanced around as if worried someone might overhear. "I didn't expect you to actually come." The words hit her like a slap. She hadn't expected a warm embrace, but she also hadn't anticipated such a cold, indifferent response. She forced a smile, trying to bridge the gap between them, to find some remnant of the bond they once shared. "I got your invitation," she said softly, her voice almost pleading. "I thought maybe." Ethan's expression tightened. "Look, I didn't think you'd actually show up," he repeated, almost as if he was trying to make sense of her presence. "I just thought it'd be polite to send an invite." Polite. The word echoed in her mind, stinging with the implication. She felt a wave of humiliation, but she steadied herself, unwilling to let it show. She looked at him, this young man who bore so little resemblance to the boy she'd raised, and tried to reach him one last time. "Ethan, I know things haven't been easy between us, but I'm here because I'm your mother, and I love you. I always have." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the hurt she'd tried to keep hidden. "I thought maybe, today, we could try to start fresh." But her words seemed to bounce off him, leaving no impact. He looked away, the awkwardness palpable, and she felt her heart sink. Just then, his fiancée, a young woman with an air of sophistication and elegance, approached. She glanced at Sarah curiously, not recognizing her. Ethan quickly introduced her, but he stumbled over the words, his hesitation clear. When he finally said, "This is my mother," the woman's expression turned surprised, as if she hadn't expected to meet Sarah at all. Sarah exchanged a polite smile with her future daughter-in-law, but she could sense the tension in the air. The woman seemed slightly thrown off, and as they talked, Sarah realized with a painful clarity that Ethan had kept his mother hidden from his new life. His fiancée barely knew anything about her, about the sacrifices she'd made, about the hardships she endured to raise him. It was as though he'd erased her from his story entirely. As Sarah stood there, feeling more like a stranger than a mother, she felt the weight of all those years of silence and separation bear down on her. She realized that Ethan had not only distanced himself, but had rewritten his history, excluding her from the life he'd built. The invitation wasn't an olive branch. It was a formality, a way to keep up appearances, nothing more. The revelation hit her hard, and she felt the air leave her lungs as she struggled to hold back the tears. The one place she'd thought she might find a sense of belonging, of reunion, had turned into a reminder of just how thoroughly she'd been cast aside. Sarah took a step back, feeling the walls close in around her. The laughter and chatter of guests blurred into a distant hum, and she felt a cold emptiness settle in her heart. She had come hoping for reconciliation, but instead, she found herself confronted by the painful truth that her son had left her behind long ago, far more than she'd ever realized. With one last look at Ethan, she forced a faint smile and whispered, "Congratulations." Then, before he could respond, she turned and walked out of the hall, leaving the life she once knew behind. Sarah walked out of the hall, her mind in a haze as she processed the coldness she'd just encountered from her own son. She had come here with her heart wide open, prepared to forgive years of abandonment, ready to mend whatever had gone wrong. But now, she felt like she was walking away with the final nail in the coffin of a relationship she had spent her life nurturing. The ache in her chest was a dull, throbbing reminder of the love she had once poured so generously into her son, love that seemed to have vanished in the glittering world he had chosen over her. She had barely made it out of the hall's grand entrance when a soft, unexpected voice called out to her, "Sarah." She turned, half expecting it to be Ethan, perhaps coming after her with a change of heart. But instead, A young woman, who had been sitting quietly in the reception area, approached her with a warm smile. She was beautiful, dressed elegantly but simply, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had an aura of grace that felt genuine, contrasting with the grandeur and glitz surrounding the wedding venue. "Hi," the woman said, her voice gentle, her eyes kind. "I'm Lily's sister. I noticed you sitting alone inside, and I thought maybe you might want some company." Sarah managed a small, grateful smile, even though her heart still felt heavy. "Thank you, dear, but I was just leaving," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's gaze softened as she seemed to notice Sarah's pained expression. "I don't mean to intrude," she began carefully, "but I can tell this is hard for you. Family can be complicated, especially on days like these." Sarah's resolve wavered, and she let out a deep sigh, feeling the weight of all those years pressing down on her. Something about this young woman's sincerity made her feel as though she didn't need to hide her feelings, at least not in this moment. "It's harder than I thought it would be," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize how much he'd change, or how much I'd been left out." The woman nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "I know it's not my place to say, but sometimes people don't understand what they've lost until it's too late. And in a place like this," she gestured subtly around the lavish hall, "it's easy to get lost in the illusion of what they think they should be, rather than remembering who they really are." Sarah felt a pang of validation, hearing those words from someone who barely knew her but could see the truth so clearly. "I raised him alone, you know," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "His father left when he was just a little boy, and I did everything I could to give him a good life. I worked my fingers to the bone. And now," her voice broke as she struggled to finish the thought, feeling the sharp sting of a reality she could hardly bear to acknowledge. "Now it's like none of it mattered." The young woman put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I don't know Ethan well, but I know that when people forget where they come from, they eventually come face to face with that loss. It catches up with them, even if it takes years. Sometimes they just need a wake-up call." Sarah looked at the woman, feeling an odd sense of comfort from her words. It was strange, but in that moment, she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. For the first time that day, she felt that maybe her pain wasn't hers alone to bear, that perhaps someone else could understand what it meant to love so deeply and lose so completely. She thanked the young woman softly, and they shared a moment of quiet understanding. As she made her way toward the parking lot, she struggled with whether to leave entirely or stay nearby, just in case. Her heart told her to hold on, to cling to any shred of hope that Ethan might come out looking for her. But her mind told her that the boy she once knew was long gone. She paused by her car, glancing back at the grand hall, torn between holding on to hope and protecting herself from more pain. As she stood there, caught between staying and leaving, a memory surfaced, a birthday from years ago. She had spent her entire day baking Ethan's favorite cake from scratch, a chocolate cake with layers of rich, creamy frosting. She'd worked double shifts that week just to afford the ingredients, and she remembered watching his face light up as she brought out the cake with a single candle on top. He was only 8 at the time, but the look on his face, the pure joy, had made every sacrifice worth it. That memory tugged at her heart, and in a moment of vulnerability, she whispered, "I don't know where you went, my boy, but I miss you." As she turned to leave, she noticed a familiar figure walking toward her from the hall. It was Ethan, his face clouded with a look of frustration and discomfort. Her heart leaped for a brief moment, hoping that perhaps he had reconsidered, that he was coming to make amends. But as he approached, she saw no warmth in his eyes. "What are you doing out here, Mom?" he asked, his tone exasperated, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I didn't want to intrude, Ethan. I just wanted to see you, to be here for you on your big day." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if he wanted to be anywhere but near her. "Look, I know you mean well, but this isn't really." It's not really a good time. The words stung, but she forced herself to remain calm. Ethan, I'm your mother. I have a right to be here, don't I? He hesitated, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite read. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just annoyance. It's just, Lily's family doesn't know much about our past, and I'd like to keep it that way, he said, his voice low and dismissive. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what he meant. He didn't just want her out of his life. He wanted to erase any trace of the life they'd once shared, the hardships they had endured together, the sacrifices she had made. To him, she was a reminder of a past he was ashamed of, a chapter he'd closed and buried deep. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she felt herself slipping, lost in the torrent of betrayal and heartbreak. Is that what I am to you, Ethan? She asked, her voice trembling. Just a part of your past that you want to forget. He didn't meet her gaze, and that hurt more than any words could have. She watched him, hoping for some sign of remorse, some flicker of the boy she once knew. But all she saw was a man who had left her far behind, a man who had chosen a different life, and was determined to leave her out of it. I'm sorry, Mom, he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of any real emotion. It's just, things are different now. With those words, he turned and walked back toward the hall, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot. She felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her unsteady and vulnerable. All those years, all those sacrifices, all that love, reduced to nothing more than a relic of a life he no longer acknowledged. She stood there for a long moment, watching as he disappeared back into the glitzy world he had chosen, leaving her behind. As she climbed into her car, tears pricking at her eyes, she wondered if she had been wrong to hope. She had come here to find closure, to mend the broken pieces of their relationship. But now, she realized, sometimes people change in ways that make it impossible to go back. She had to accept that the son she had known and loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw her as nothing more than a distant memory. With a heavy heart, she started the engine and drove away, the grandeur of the wedding venue fading in her rearview mirror. Sarah drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, her mind racing with thoughts and memories of Ethan as a boy, the sound of his laughter, the light in his eyes that once lit up her entire world. She had replayed every word of their last conversation in her mind over and over, each replay eroding a bit more of the fragile hope she had clung to. The silence in her car was oppressive, and she finally pulled over to the side of the road, unable to hold back the wave of emotion that crashed over her. Her body shook with sobs, the years of heartache pouring out of her in one shuddering release. She had spent so much of her life pouring love into raising Ethan, but now she felt hollow, as if all that love had been poured into a bottomless well that had drained her dry. She whispered into the empty car, "Where did I go wrong? What more could I have done?" But the silence offered no answers, and the open road before her only seemed to mirror the emptiness she felt inside. As she sat there, something inside her shifted. She realized that she had spent so much time waiting, hoping, and yearning for Ethan to come back to her, to give her even the smallest acknowledgement of the love and sacrifices he had made. But she couldn't keep living like that. She couldn't keep waiting for someone who had clearly chosen to forget her. She needed to find her own closure, her own path forward, one that didn't revolve around her son's validation. With a deep, shuddering breath, Sarah wiped her eyes and pulled herself together. She glanced at the wedding invitation sitting on the passenger seat, now crumpled and worn. She didn't need it anymore, and in a sudden burst of resolve, she tore it into pieces, letting the fragments fall into the empty seat beside her. It felt strangely liberating, like she was finally letting go of a weight she'd carried for too long. She didn't need an invitation to belong in Ethan's life, and if he couldn't see her value, then that was his loss, not hers. Determined to reclaim some semblance of control, Sarah decided to go for a drive through the city, stopping at places she hadn't visited in years. She found herself drawn to the places that held memories, not only of Ethan, but of her own life before motherhood had become her entire identity. She wandered through the old bookshop she used to visit when she was younger, flipping through pages of novels she once loved but had long abandoned for the responsibilities of single parenthood. She stopped by a park where she and Ethan used to feed the ducks, sitting by the pond and watching the sun dip low over the water. These were her places, her memories, and as she revisited them, she felt a strange sense of peace, as if she were reconnecting with parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of her devotion to Ethan. As dusk began to fall, Sarah's phone buzzed in her purse, pulling her from her reverie. She glanced at the screen and was surprised to see an unknown number. She hesitated, a flicker of curiosity tugging at her, and finally answered. "Hello," she said, her voice still shaky but steadier than before. "Hi, Sarah, it's Lily," came a soft, familiar voice. There was a pause, as if Lily wasn't quite sure how to continue. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from Ethan. I know this might be a little unexpected." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to hear from anyone related to the wedding, especially not Lily. "Of course, it's okay," Sarah replied, her tone cautious but open. Is everything all right?" Lily hesitated on the other end of the line, as if gathering her thoughts. "To be honest, Sarah, I don't know," she admitted, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Today, well, it didn't go the way I thought it would. I could tell something was wrong between you and Ethan, and I need to understand it. I need to know the truth." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a surge of emotions rush through her. For so long, she had wanted someone, anyone, to understand the pain she'd been carrying, to see the love and sacrifices she had made. She took a deep breath, then finally said, "If you really want to know, Lily, I'll tell you. But it's not an easy story to hear." They agreed to meet at a small, quiet cafe in a part of town where Sarah felt comfortable. It was a cozy place, the kind where conversations felt private, shielded by the comforting hum of background chatter and the aroma of fresh coffee. When Sarah arrived, Lily was already there, seated by the window with a look of quiet anticipation on her face. She smiled warmly as Sarah approached, her eyes filled with a kindness that made Sarah's heart ache a little less. For a moment, they sat in silence, sipping their coffee, each gathering the courage to broach the subject that had brought them together. Finally, Lily spoke. "I knew Ethan had a complicated relationship with his past, but I didn't realize." She trailed off, searching for the right words. "I didn't realize he had a mother who cared so much." Sarah managed a small, sad smile. "It's not something he's eager to share, is it?" Lily shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "He never talked about his childhood much. He made it sound like he'd always been alone, like he had to fend for himself." She looked at Sarah, her eyes searching. "But I can see that's not the case. I can see the love you have for him, even after everything." Sarah's throat tightened, and she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I loved him more than anything in this world," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was all he had after his father left. And I tried so hard to be everything he needed, but somewhere along the way, he decided I wasn't enough." They talked for hours, Sarah sharing the memories, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the unconditional love she had poured into raising Ethan. She told Lily about the late nights, the double shifts, the moments of exhaustion and joy, and the heartbreak of watching her son grow into a man who no longer wanted her in his life. Lily listened intently, her expression shifting from surprise to sorrow, to quiet admiration as Sarah recounted her story. By the end of the evening, Lily looked at Sarah with tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me all of this," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand. "I wish Ethan could see what I see in you, a mother who gave everything she had. It breaks my heart to think he doesn't appreciate that." Sarah nodded, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "Maybe one day he will. Maybe one day he'll understand what it means to be a parent, to love someone so deeply that you're willing to sacrifice everything for them." Lily's gaze softened, and Sarah could see the spark of determination in her eyes. "If there's one thing I've learned today, it's that he needs to hear this story from you. I can't change his mind, but maybe, just maybe, your words can reach him." She paused, a glimmer of hope in her voice. "Would you be willing to try again? To talk to him? To show him what he's missing?" Sarah hesitated, her heart a mix of hope and fear. She had tried so many times before, reaching out, only to be met with silence or rejection. But now, with someone like Lily by her side, someone who believed in her and saw her worth, she felt a new sense of strength. She didn't need Ethan's acceptance to validate her life, but perhaps she owed it to herself to give him one last chance, for her own peace, if nothing else. They left the cafe with a plan. Lily would talk to Ethan, prepare him for the conversation, and try to help him understand the importance of this moment. Sarah knew it was a long shot, that there was a very real possibility he would refuse. But she also knew that she was no longer afraid of his rejection. She had found something more valuable that day: her own strength, her own story, and the courage to face whatever came next. As she walked away, Sarah felt a lightness in her heart that she hadn't felt in years. She was ready, finally, to face her son not as the mother who had been abandoned, but as a woman who had fought and survived, who had given everything she had, and who had nothing left to prove. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with that. Lily had managed to arrange a meeting between Sarah and Ethan for the following evening. She had worked carefully, explaining to Ethan that his mother had things she needed to say, and that he, too, deserved the chance to understand the past he seemed so eager to escape. Despite her gentle insistence, it hadn't been easy. Ethan had been resistant, his stubbornness manifesting in a blend of anger and discomfort. But Lily's earnestness, her quiet plea for him to just listen, eventually swayed him. He agreed, reluctantly, to meet Sarah at a nearby cafe. Sarah spent the entire day leading up to the meeting filled with apprehension. She prepared herself by going over everything she wanted to say, wondering if she could finally make him understand, or if she was just setting herself up for more pain. The wound of his rejection was still raw, but with the glimmer of hope Lily had given her, she felt that, no matter what happened, this meeting was a chance for her to find some semblance of closure. She could let him know, once and for all, how deeply she had loved him, how much she had given up for him, and what it had cost her to let him go. The cafe they had chosen was a quiet place with soft lighting, a small oasis away from the bustling city. As she walked in, Sarah noticed Ethan already seated in a secluded corner, his gaze fixed on his phone, as if searching for a distraction. She took a steadying breath, straightened her shoulders, and made her way over to him. When he looked up, there was an unmistakable tension in his face, a mixture of impatience and guardedness. She smiled, but he only offered a curt nod in return, clearly uncomfortable. Sarah took a seat across from him, placing her hands carefully on the table, trying to calm the nervous trembling that had taken over. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, almost unbearable, as if it held all the unspoken words, the years of hurt, and the distance that had grown between them. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Thank you for coming, Ethan," she began softly, her voice trembling just slightly. "I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." He nodded, his gaze shifting slightly, still avoiding her eyes. "Lily said you wanted to talk," he replied, his tone flat, as if he were forcing himself to stay polite. Sarah swallowed, feeling the weight of everything she wanted to say pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't waste this moment. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, and began. "I know things haven't been easy between us, and I try to understand why," she said, her voice steadying. "But I need you to understand that everything I did, every sacrifice I made, was for you. When your father left, I didn't know how I was going to manage. But I made it my mission to give you the best life I could, even if it meant working multiple jobs, even if it meant giving up things I wanted for myself." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to his hands. He looked like he wanted to interrupt, but Sarah continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. I watched you grow, and I saw how much potential you had. You were smart, kind, and full of dreams, and I wanted you to have those dreams, even if it meant I had to put mine aside. I wanted you to have the world, Ethan. Her voice softened, a note of sadness creeping in. But somewhere along the way, it seems I lost you. He sighed, finally looking up at her, his expression unreadable. Mom, I know you worked hard, and I'm grateful. But I didn't want that life. I wanted something different, something better. Sarah's heart ached at his words, but she knew he was being honest. She nodded slowly, trying to understand. I know, and I never wanted to hold you back. I wanted you to be successful, to reach for things that I couldn't. But I didn't expect that you'd feel like you had to leave me behind to do that. Ethan glanced away, and Sarah could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes. It was a small gesture, but it gave her hope. She continued, her tone growing more firm, more resolute. Maybe I made mistakes. Maybe I tried too hard. Maybe I clung to you when I should have let you go. But I never once stopped loving you. And I never expected that love to be something you'd feel you needed to escape from. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. I came to your wedding, Ethan, because I thought it was a chance for us to finally put everything behind us. But the way you treated me, like a stranger, it hurt more than you can imagine. He shifted uncomfortably, and she could see the emotion swirling in his eyes, though he was doing his best to mask them. Finally, he spoke, his voice laced with frustration and regret. It's hard, Mom. People don't understand. They see where I come from, and they judge. They think I'm less because of it. Sarah felt her heart break a little at his words. She had always known he struggled with her modest life, with her long hours and worn-out clothes, but she hadn't realized just how deeply it had affected him. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Ethan, if the people around you judge you for where you come from, then they don't know who you really are. And if you believe that you need to cut ties with your past to be successful, then you're losing a part of yourself. She paused, her eyes searching his. I didn't raise you to be ashamed of where you come from. I raised you to be proud, to be strong, to be kind. That's the Ethan I remember. He looked down, his face contorting with a mixture of shame and sadness. There was a long silence as he seemed to wrestle with his emotions, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you to see what I'd become. I was afraid that you'd be disappointed in me. The vulnerability in his voice took her by surprise, and she reached out, placing her hand gently over his. Oh, Ethan, she whispered, her voice filled with love and pain. I could never be disappointed in you. All I ever wanted was for you to be happy. I would have accepted any life you chose, as long as you were honest with me, as long as you stayed true to yourself. Ethan's shoulders slumped, the weight of years of regret and shame visible in his posture. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since they sat down. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, his voice breaking. I thought that by building a new life, I could forget the parts that were hard, the parts that made me feel small. But I see now that I was wrong. I didn't need to forget you to move forward. I didn't know how to face it. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, and she squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth and closeness she hadn't felt in years. It's never too late, Ethan. We can start again, right here, right now. I don't need anything from you except the truth and a chance to be part of your life, no matter how small a part. They sat there in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle between them, the years of distance slowly dissolving in the warmth of shared understanding. Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, a feeling that perhaps all was not lost. For the first time in a long time, she saw the glimmer of the boy she had raised, the boy who had once been the center of her world. Ethan took a deep breath, wiping his eyes with a shaky hand, and nodded. "I'd like that, Mom. I don't know where to start, but I'd like to try." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with love and relief. "We'll figure it out together," she said softly, "one step at a time." The evening passed in a quiet, tentative peace as they spoke, not as strangers, but as family. They shared stories, laughter, and finally, the hope of healing. As they left the cafe, Ethan surprised her by pulling her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness she hadn't felt from him in years. In that embrace, Sarah felt the weight of all her sacrifices, all her years of waiting and hoping, melt away. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on that road together. As they parted ways that night, Ethan turned back to her, his face softened by a smile she recognized from long ago. "Thank you, Mom, for everything." Watching him walk away, Sarah felt a quiet pride blossom in her heart. She had come seeking closure, but she had found something far more precious, the chance to rebuild the love that had never truly left them. And as she walked home, her heart filled with peace, she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, knowing that she was no longer waiting, but moving forward, hand in hand with the son she had never stopped loving. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of lightness that felt almost foreign. She lay in bed for a few moments, letting herself soak in the lingering warmth of last night's reunion. There was a new, quiet hope looming in her heart, the hope that maybe, just maybe, the years of loneliness and heartache were finally behind her. She and Ethan had begun to bridge the chasm that had kept them apart, and though it was just a first step, it felt monumental. She spent her morning reflecting, thinking about the changes she'd been through and the resilience that had brought her to this moment. For so long, her love for Ethan had been a source of pain, a reminder of all that she'd lost. But now, it was shifting into something stronger, something that felt whole and mended. The grief she'd carried was slowly being replaced by the possibility of a new beginning. Later that afternoon, Sarah decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. She strolled through familiar streets, her mind wandering back to the countless memories tied to this place. She passed the old grocery store where she'd once worked long hours, the small park where she'd taught Ethan to ride his bike, and the cozy library where she'd spent countless evenings reading to him when he was a child. Each landmark held echoes of their past life together, reminding her of all the little moments that had shaped their bond. As she walked, she heard the sound of children's laughter nearby and glanced over to see a group of kids playing by the swings. A wave of nostalgia washed over her, and she felt a pang of longing for those simpler days, when Ethan was still young and their world felt safe and whole. But there was also a sense of closure. She felt like she was finally letting go of the weight she'd carried, moving forward into a future she had once thought lost. Just as she was turning to head back home, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and was surprised to see a message from Lily. It was an invitation to come over for dinner that evening at their new apartment, Ethan's place. The message was warm and inviting, with a hint of excitement, as if Lily genuinely looked forward to spending time with her. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to be invited so soon, and the thought of sitting down with both Ethan and Lily, sharing a meal as a family, felt both thrilling and a little terrifying. After a moment's hesitation, she replied with a simple, heartfelt, "I'd love to." She spent the next few hours in nervous anticipation, wondering what this evening would hold. She knew that last night had been a breakthrough, but this was different. This was a step toward building a new relationship, not just with Ethan, but with Lily too. She wanted to make a good impression, to show them both that she was ready to be a part of their lives in whatever way they'd let her. As evening fell, Sarah dressed carefully, choosing a modest but elegant outfit. She took a final look in the mirror, steadying herself with a deep breath before heading out. When she arrived at their apartment building, a modest but well-kept place in the city, she felt a mix of pride and nerves. This was Ethan's life now, a life he built for himself, with someone he loved. She was proud of him, despite everything, and she hoped he could sense that. Ethan greeted her at the door, his expression softer than it had been in years. There was a hint of a smile on his face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a genuine warmth between them. "Hey, Mom," he said, opening the door wider for her to step in. "I'm glad you could make it." The casual warmth in his tone made her heart swell. She stepped inside, taking in the cozy, modern apartment. It was small but filled with personal touches, photographs on the wall, a stack of books on the coffee table, and a few houseplants near the window. It felt lived in and loved, a place where he could start fresh with Lily. Lily appeared from the kitchen, carrying a dish of roasted vegetables, and greeted Sarah with a warm smile. "Welcome, Sarah. I hope you're hungry. Ethan and I made a few of our favorite dishes, though I can't promise they'll be as good as yours." Sarah chuckled, feeling her nerves begin to ease. "I'm sure it'll be wonderful," she replied, touched by the effort they'd put into the meal. She took a seat at the table, where Ethan had set out plates, silverware, and glasses, arranging everything with a precision that reminded her of the little boy who used to line up his toys in perfect rows. As they settled down to eat, Sarah marveled at how natural it felt to sit here with them. The conversation flowed easily, and she found herself laughing and sharing stories from her childhood, stories she hadn't thought about in years. Ethan and Lily listened with genuine interest, and Sarah could see the curiosity and warmth in Lily's eyes as she absorbed each memory, piecing together the parts of Ethan's past that had remained hidden. At one point, Ethan surprised her by asking, "Mom, do you remember the time we went camping at Willow Lake?" He looked at her, his eyes bright with a hint of nostalgia. "I think I was, 8 or 9? Sarah's face lit up with recognition. "Of course I remember. You spent the whole night terrified of every little sound, convinced that a bear was going to come after us." She laughed, and Ethan joined in, the sound of his laughter filling her with a joy she hadn't felt in years. "Yeah, but you stayed up with me the whole night," he said, his voice softening. "You told me stories until I finally fell asleep." He paused, glancing down as if embarrassed by the admission. "I don't think I ever thanked you for that." Sarah felt her throat tighten, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "You don't need to thank me, Ethan," she said gently. "That's what mothers are for." The evening continued with stories and laughter, the three of them forging new memories to replace the painful ones of the past. At one point, Lily left the table briefly and returned with a small, beautifully wrapped box. She placed it in front of Sarah with a shy smile. "We wanted you to have this," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Curious, Sarah carefully unwrapped the box, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a small heart-shaped charm. Engraved on the charm were the words, "Always loved." She looked up, her eyes filling with tears as she realized the significance of the gift. "Thank you," she whispered, overcome with emotion. "This means more than I can say." Ethan reached out, placing his hand over hers. "We wanted you to know, Mom, you were always loved. I was just too stubborn and proud to show it, but you never stopped being in my heart." Sarah's heart swelled with a joy that was both overwhelming and healing. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of all the love, forgiveness, and acceptance that had brought them to this moment. They sat together, their hands intertwined, the wounds of the past beginning to heal with each word, each touch. As the evening drew to a close, they walked her to the door, sharing hugs that were warm and lingering. She could feel the sincerity in Ethan's embrace, a silent promise that he wouldn't let her go again. She turned to Lily, who wrapped her arms around her with a genuine warmth that made Sarah feel truly welcome. "Thank you for bringing us together, Lily," Sarah whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." Lily smiled, her eyes shining. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. Family is worth fighting for. I'm just glad I could help." As Sarah walked home that night, the bracelet glinting softly on her wrist, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had come so close to losing hope, to believing that her sacrifices had been in vain, that her love had gone unappreciated. But now she saw the truth. That love had always been there, buried beneath layers of pain, pride, and misunderstandings. She felt a profound gratitude, not only for the reconciliation, but for the journey that had led her here. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of tension and memories of the painful years she had endured. But now she had a family to face those moments with, a family that had chosen to come together despite the years of hurt. And as she walked into her modest home, her heart filled with love, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with laughter, forgiveness, and the kind of love that could weather any storm. The days after that fateful dinner passed like a dream for Sarah. She felt as though she had emerged from a long, dark tunnel and was finally walking in the sunlight. Her daily routine had transformed, not because anything outwardly significant had changed, but because the weight she'd been carrying for years had lifted. Ethan had called her a few times since their dinner, and each conversation was another stitch in the wound that was slowly healing. They spoke about simple things: his work, her plans to volunteer at the local library, memories they shared. It was as though they were building their relationship from scratch, piece by piece. One sunny afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call from Lily, who sounded excited yet slightly nervous. "Sarah, I hope this isn't too short notice, but we're having a small gathering at our apartment this weekend," Lily explained. "It's just a few friends, and we thought it'd be wonderful if you could come." Sarah hesitated, surprised by the invitation. She hadn't anticipated being part of Ethan and Lily's social circle, not so soon. But the prospect thrilled her, filling her with a sense of inclusion she hadn't felt in years. "I'd love to come, Lily," she replied, her voice tinged with excitement. On Saturday evening, Sarah dressed with a mix of pride and nervousness. She carefully chose a dress that was elegant but understated, something that made her feel both confident and comfortable. As she looked in the mirror, she realized that she hadn't felt this alive in years. There was a light in her eyes, a spark that she hadn't recognized in herself for a long time. When she arrived at the apartment, she could hear the lively murmur of voices and laughter even before she reached the door. She took a deep breath, calming her nerves, and knocked lightly. Ethan opened the door with a warm smile that made her heart swell with gratitude. "Mom, you made it," he exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. His embrace was strong and genuine, the kind that reassured her that she was truly welcome in his life now. Inside, the apartment was filled with warmth and energy. There were a handful of people, laughing, talking, and filling the space with a joyful atmosphere. Sarah felt a moment of trepidation, wondering if she would fit in, if she would feel like an outsider in her own son's world. But Lily quickly ushered her in, introducing her to everyone with genuine excitement. "Everyone, this is Sarah, Ethan's mom," Lily announced with a smile. "She's as lovely as we all imagined." Sarah blushed, feeling both flattered and slightly overwhelmed. But her nerves quickly dissipated as she fell into conversation with the others, who welcomed her warmly, asking questions and sharing stories. They were all kind, interesting people, and as she mingled, Sarah realized just how far Ethan had come, not just in terms of career, but in building a life surrounded by good-hearted, genuine people. At one point in the evening, Sarah found herself standing by the kitchen with a glass of wine, watching Ethan as he talked animatedly with a few of his friends. She saw him laugh, his eyes crinkling with joy, and felt a deep sense of pride. This was the son she had raised, the one she had always believed in, and seeing him so content filled her with indescribable happiness. It was a reminder that, despite everything, she had succeeded in giving him a foundation strong enough to lead him to this place. A little while later, Ethan walked over to her, his face alight with excitement. "Mom, come with me," he said, taking her hand and leading her to the balcony. The evening air was cool and refreshing, and they stood together, overlooking the city lights that stretched out before them. For a few moments, they stood in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice soft and reflective. "I never told you this, but I really owe a lot of who I am to you, he said, his gaze focused on the skyline. I know I tried to deny it for a long time. But everything you did, everything you sacrificed, I see it now, and I'm so sorry it took me this long to understand. Sarah felt her throat tighten, and she placed a gentle hand on his arm. Ethan, I never did any of it for thanks. I did it because I loved you. I still do, and I always will. You're my son, and no amount of time or distance could ever change that. He nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. I wasted so many years, Mom. Years I can't get back. But I want you to know that I'm going to make it right. I'm going to make sure you know how much you mean to me, every single day. They stood there, side by side, the weight of the past slowly fading into the background. Sarah felt as though her heart had finally mended, the scars left by the years of separation softened by the love and understanding they had found in each other. This was the peace she had yearned for, the kind of reconciliation that made every painful memory worth it. As the night wore on, the party began to wind down. People started saying their goodbyes, hugging each other, and heading home. Ethan and Lily walked Sarah to the door, and before she left, they each gave her a warm embrace. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, respect, and the shared understanding they had fought so hard to reach. But Sarah's journey wasn't over. In the weeks that followed, she found herself reconnecting with parts of herself that had been dormant for years. Inspired by her newfound bond with Ethan and the joy of feeling truly valued, she decided to pursue something she had always dreamed of, volunteering at the local community center, where she could help young single mothers navigate the struggles she had once faced. She wanted to be a beacon for women who, like her, had sacrificed everything for their children, who felt invisible or forgotten. She wanted to share her story, her resilience, and her journey toward healing and reconciliation. Her work at the community center quickly became a source of purpose and joy. She found herself surrounded by people who appreciated her wisdom and kindness, and she realized that, for the first time, she was living a life that was fully her own. She was no longer waiting for validation or clinging to the past. She was a woman with her own identity, one that was rich with experience, strength, and love. One evening, as Sarah was closing up at the center, she received a text from Ethan. "Mom, we'd love to have you over for dinner tomorrow. There's something special we want to talk to you about." Curious and slightly intrigued, Sarah agreed, wondering what surprise awaited her. The next evening, she arrived at Ethan and Lily's apartment, where they greeted her with beaming smiles. After dinner, Lily took her hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Sarah," she began, her voice filled with warmth, "we have some news. Ethan and we're going to have a baby." Sarah's eyes widened, her heart swelling with joy and disbelief. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with a gentle, loving smile, and she felt a surge of emotion she hadn't felt in years. She would be a grandmother. The thought filled her with a profound happiness that was almost overwhelming. "You're going to be an amazing grandmother, Mom," Ethan said softly, taking her hands in his. "And I promise, this time, we're going to do it right. We're going to make sure that our family is built on love and respect, the way you always wanted." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she pulled them both into a tight embrace. She felt as though she were standing at the start of a beautiful journey, one that was filled with endless possibilities and the chance to be part of something wonderful. The love she had poured into Ethan had come full circle, blossoming into a new generation, a new beginning. As she held them close, Sarah whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. She had waited, endured, and loved fiercely. And now, in the twilight of her life, she was surrounded by the family she had always dreamed of. Her story had not ended in loneliness or sorrow. It had transformed, shaped by love and resilience, into a legacy of forgiveness, healing, and hope. She had come full circle, her heart healed, her family whole, and her life rich with purpose and joy. And as she looked forward to the future, filled with the promise of new memories and endless love, she knew that this was only the beginning.